Christmas week. Merry Christmas, happy holidays to all of you from all of us here at OutKick, all of us at Fox Sports Radio. Clay Travis, he's down in Orlando. I'm Jason Martin. Find him on Twitter. You probably already do, at Clay Travis. You can find me at JMart Radio. Find the brand at OutKick. We talked in the first hour, Clay, about the college football playoff, and neither one of us was surprised. We both kind of had this pegged in. This is exactly what we anticipated. I want to lead you in a different direction to start here because I didn't get to this in the first hour of the show, and that was, so Jimbo comes out on Saturday and says, we should be in, blah, 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 blah. And then I look at their schedule, and I don't even need to go down all of what they did. Their one loss was to number one in the country, and they got beat by 4 touchdowns. Notre Dame's one loss came to the number 2 team in the country, and they got beat basically by the same, just a few less points. It was 34-10 as opposed to 52-24, but the difference was 4 points. So you can look at those things that way. Here's the question I have for you to lead into all this, and then you can talk about all of these teams and how this sets up. But when Florida lost to LSU, was that pretty much it for Texas A&M?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things that hurt Texas A&M. Outside of the fact that they got blown out like they did by Alabama, losing by 28 in October. I think not getting to play against Ole Miss hurt them because it took them out of the top of mind and top of discussion in the same way that kind of happened to Cincinnati when they didn't play for a month. Any discussion about Cincinnati being a potential playoff team kind of vanished. And so I think that in and of itself really did a tough situation for them. And then I think you're right. When Florida lost, it undercut in a big way their number one win, because I think if Florida hadn't lost to LSU and they had won by double digits as we anticipated would have happened, then the storyline coming out of that game against Alabama would have been, boy, Florida's really good, right? Because they would have hung 46 on Alabama.
Right.
They would have had a chance to actually win that game, and I think it would have helped Texas A&M to a large extent. But I think what A&M was running into, J. Martin, and in a big picture here situation, is television has lost a lot of money this year. Because there have been a lot fewer games, a lot lower viewership as a result of total, mass hours watched. And as a result, I think when you actually break it down, this is what television needed, which was 4 big, huge brands, Alabama against Notre Dame, even if Alabama's a 19-point favorite, Clemson against Ohio State, even if Clemson is nearly a touchdown favorite, and even if we're going to be likely to watch another Alabama-Clemson game in the postseason for the 5th time, like appears to be very likely to occur. If all of that ends up happening, then television will at least have their audience. And so I think the biggest issue that A&M had was certainly there were several different factors that could have helped them, but ultimately it was getting blown out by Alabama and the expectation being that they weren't that good. And then also not having a transcendent player, a Kyle Trask, a Devontae Smith, a Trevor Lawrence, a Justin Fields, at least with that expectation. There was never really anybody that captured the nation's attention at A&M in a way that would make everybody pay a lot of attention to them. And again, if you could go back in time and you were talking to Jimbo Fisher and you said, hey, what could make the most sense for you going forward, I think 9-1 helps them. And I think certainly if Florida's only 2 losses are Texas A&M and Alabama, and both those games are close, it would have helped their resume as well.
Yeah, and their resume, look, 17-12 to Vanderbilt, that hurt them. 28-14 to even beating Mississippi State. That's not a good football team at all.
I mean, look, they've won 6 games in a row by double digits in the SEC, which is hard to do. And I think ultimately that kind of hung there on them. But, yes, they started very slow. And this goes to expectations. The expectation was after A&M barely beat Vanderbilt and was not very good against Alabama and got blown out, was Jimbo Fisher's the most overpaid coach in college football.
Mm-hmm.
And the win over Florida helped to change that narrative, but I don't think it ever really changed the narrative. And so for a lot of people, A&M was a pretender And even if you aren't a believer in Ohio State this year, you know that Ohio State won the title in their first year. A&M's never been there before, and I think that worked against them.
So, yeah, the Ohio State point's exactly where I think we need to go here now, because if there's one thing that we have learned about 2020, it's that fairness has gone out the window. It's gone out the window, not just in sports, but in life. If you live in South Dakota, you've been able to live your life. If you've lived in Florida, you've been able to live your life. If you've lived in California, there might be people outside your house right now in case you decide you want to walk to your mailbox. Like, there's been a lot of differences across the board. So we knew going into the college football season it wasn't going to be fair. It wasn't going to be equitable outcomes, to say the least. And Ohio State played 6 games, almost got beaten by Indiana, didn't look good against Northwestern outside of Sermon, who I think just ran for another touchdown in the background. But outside of that, like, Ohio State wasn't particularly distinguished. Now, they were hit hard with COVID in terms of guys being out, but 6 wins. And then you do have to talk to a Texas A&M that played all SEC opponents and only has 1 blemish on that resume with 8 victories over SEC. I mean, I understand their argument more so about Ohio State than anything else.
Look, I think a lot of the college football playoff is about branding. And I think A&M has not branded itself as one of the elite members of the college football fraternity right now. And that is because historically they haven't been, right? They showed up for Johnny Manziel. They won the Heisman Trophy with him. They had a really, really good football team then. But I don't think that other than that, people buy into now the Notre Dame brand. They buy into Alabama, Clemson, certainly, and Ohio State. And ultimately the big brands get an advantage over the Cincinnatis, over the, frankly, Indianas, over the
Coastals.
Iowa States. All of those teams may be good, but college football uniquely, you have to prove to us that you're good. And I've made this argument for a long time. College football is fundamentally different than college basketball. What makes college basketball and the NCAA tournament so phenomenal is the Cinderella. People are 100 billion% against the idea of any Cinderellas existing in college football. Mm-hmm. And it's really kind of interesting to think about. Why do we buy into the idea in the NCAA tournament that anybody could win the championship, right? On any given game, any team can win 6 games in a row. When Virginia loses to whatever, Maryland, Baltimore County, if I'm remembering correctly, who beat them, then people go ecstatic. They're joyful. They are filled with glee. And yet, when you start to ask a question, hey, does Cincinnati deserve to be in the college football playoff, or Coastal Carolina, or BYU, or any of these other schools? It's like immediately people become indignant. And I know it's different sports, basketball versus football, but it's college, right? And yet in one, we are ecstatic about the way things break down. In the other, we find it to be totally unacceptable that an underdog could even get an opportunity to beat a favorite.
Yeah, well, I think it has to do with the amount of teams in the tournament compared to what's allowed in college football. And then you get into the discussion of, and I think we're both on this same side, unless I'm mistaken, where the 8-team model, where all the Power 5 champions get in, one of the have-nots, the top-ranked have-not gets in, and then you have 2 that you can debate to get to 8. I think maybe that – I know you're always going to have a discussion about 9, 10, whatever like that, or who should be 8, but I think that gives you the opportunity. But I think generally you can cheer for a Cinderella in college basketball because damn near everybody's going to get in anyway, and then you're cheering for the tournament. And I also think that there's a perception, and at least it's my perception, that the difference between the talent and the level of football being played in one of those conferences, particularly like an SEC, as opposed to what you're seeing from Liberty or Coastal Carolina or Central Florida, the difference between the haves and the have-nots, to me, is just gigantic in football compared to basketball. Maybe it's just because of the way the sport is played, how many people are on the field, what has to go right, all of those things. For some reason, I've never seen it the same way in basketball, and I think it's just because we're cheering on a tournament where so many people are going to get in anyway.
I'll tell you this. and that's an interesting argument. Alabama is favored over Notre Dame by 19 points, which is not that much different than a 1 seed is typically favored over a 16 seed, right?
Yeah.
In the NCAA tournament,
Yeah.
there are, a 2 versus a 15. A lot of those lines end up being 20 points, 19 points, 22 points, in that vicinity. And so I think what we have seen, and this is the larger issue with college football. First of all, I think they're going to go to 8, and I think they're going to go to 8 next year because there's going to be such desperation in many of these athletic departments to try to make up the money that they lost from this COVID year when they weren't able to have crowds, when the donations were likely down in a big way. So I think that there's a very high likelihood that we are going to see that take place, that end up happening, and go to 8. But I think it's just going to reiterate how much of a gap there is between the very highest echelon of college football and the next level, and that to me is what the playoff has created that I didn't necessarily anticipate, which is it's creating a cycle where the same teams are getting in the playoff over and over and over again. And that's leading to a cycle where they end up recruiting at an entirely different level because guys want to go play in the playoff, right? They want to contend for a championship, and the playoff has become bigger. And as a result, everything else in college football doesn't matter as much. And so I think one way to help that is to expand the overall playoff. But ultimately, you go look at recruiting class rankings, and we had the early signing day on Wednesday. Alabama and Ohio State and Clemson and Georgia basically finish in the top 5 every year. And so if you're a Georgia fan, you can fairly say, hey, what if we'd had JT Daniels playing earlier? Why did we wait so long to bring him in at quarterback? What if Justin Fields had never actually transferred? There are lots of questions you can ask. I think that right quarterback can take you to the next level and make you a champion, but the difference between being elite and having all that 4- and 5-star talent, winning 9 or 10 games a year, and winning a championship is, as you saw with LSU last year, often just having the right quarterback at the right spot. And I think college football has become really a sport that's defined by 2 people, the head coach and the quarterback.
Yeah.
Even more so than anywhere else. And it used to be, a guy like Nick Saban could win championships with A.J. McCarron or Jacob Coker, these sort of journeyman game-managing style quarterbacks, Blake Sims.
McElroy.
But now, McElroy. Now, Alabama, Mac Jones may win the Heisman, and before that you had Tua. The Alabama perception of what's required out of the quarterback has fundamentally altered.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, Jalen Hurts had to transfer because he wasn't as good a thrower. He wasn't quite as prolific. He wasn't as explosive as Tua was, even though Jalen Hurts only lost 2 games the entire time he was Alabama. So everything shifted. Another thing, and you said this in the first hour of the show, and I wanted to circle back to it in a different direction here, that you don't do like a preseason ranking at OutKick. And I think we've come to a point where if I'm one of the little guys, and that's not to be disrespectful, it's just that's probably how they see themselves today, the Cincinnatis of the world, the Coastal Carolinas of the world, even the BYUs of the world, teams like that. I want an end to preseason polls because, in effect, it creates a hurdle I have to overcome before I ever even play because I'm never going to supplant Ohio State if they're in the preseason top 3 and they don't lose. Even if they don't lose impressively, they're not going to drop out. That's just not the way this system works, is it?
No, and I think you're hitting on a big issue, and that's why part of me thinks like the group of 5 should just stage their own playoff, as opposed to trying to get into the group of 6 or the big 6 or whatever you want to call it. I mean, one of the storylines that I think continues to grow is every year the bowls matter less. Right, and the bowls really don't make a lot of sense at all in the first place. And I understand that you may want to play in a bowl game and you may want to play an additional game and all those factors that can be at play there. But in the grand scheme of things, as you expand the playoff, the bowl games matter less and less. And they've never really made very much sense. I mean, they're sort of, I would say, a vestigial organ of the college football universe. Like, why does college football have such incredible home field advantages? I mean, if you are a college football fan and you get the opportunity to go to South Bend or Tuscaloosa or into Columbus to watch, just insert whatever team has the best home field advantage right now in your favorite conference, and what that experience of going on the road and being able to watch a game is like. Why would you then move everything to this antiseptic environment for the postseason in order to make the Bulls happy, right? To me, if college football goes to 8, it's a really easy solution, and it would further value the overall regular season to simply say, hey, we're going to play the first round of the college football playoff, 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, 3 versus 6, 4 versus 5. We're going to do all that on campus. And if you look to the NFL, who knows a little bit of something about making money, if you look to the NFL, they only play one game every year at a neutral site, the Super Bowl. And the reason why they do that is because the Super Bowl is such a monumentally massive undertaking that it would be very hard to play a game suddenly in Green Bay like the Super Bowl, right? I mean, you've been to a lot of the media events surrounding the Super Bowl. I mean, it is like the Olympics almost. The number of people that come into town, the number of hotel rooms you're going to need, all of those things. And so it's laughably absurd to think that you're going to be able to do that in many of the cities that would be theoretically playing host to those games. But that's the exception, right? In the NFL, every other game is about having home field advantage to get to the Super Bowl. I don't really have a problem with playing one championship game in a neutral site venue where you can control the weather like the NFL does for the most part, right? Hey, we're going to play a game in Florida or in Arizona or Southern California or Texas or inside of a dome where we know that the overall weather is going to be able to get things done. But in general, that is something that I think college football gets wrong, and I hope if they go to 8, they're going to go back to that home field advantage because it actually makes seeding matter a bit more. And over the last 2 years, I do think seeding has mattered a great deal because I think there's a pretty big drop-off last year between Ohio State and Clemson and Oklahoma, and LSU being the 1 seed and getting to play Oklahoma gave them an easier route. Now, I think they would have beaten whoever they played against because they were that good. And I also think Alabama against Notre Dame is an easier pathway than it would be with potentially having to go through Clemson and Ohio State and beat both of those teams.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, this is another Notre Dame team that's going to walk in and people are going to say kind things about them and they're going to get boat raced. I mean, we've seen this happen in the CFP before. I never thought – you tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. It was Clemson, Ohio State, and Alabama before the year in whatever order you wanted to put them in. And then there is a pretty substantial drop-off, and then you get to whatever number 4 was. Because I even made the point, look, by the eye test, I'm not all that impressed with Texas A&M. But truthfully, I wasn't all that impressed with Notre Dame either. I mean, their other win was against North Carolina, who they were overrated to say the least. And so I just looked at it, it's just like there's 3 really good teams, and then there's whatever you want outside of that.
Yeah, look, and again, I think that's the one advantage of the playoff. Like this year, COVID year, and we started off talking about this in the first hour of the program. I don't think we can praise the SEC, the ACC, and the Big 12 enough for finding a way to not only play their seasons, but to do it in a healthy way with fans present as well, and crown legitimate champions. I think there are a lot of people out there who are rolling their eyes at the idea that 4-2 Oregon is the Pac-12 champion. I think there are a lot of people still upset that Ohio State only had to win 6 games to be the Big Ten champion. I don't think there's anybody out there who's like, man, who's not a legit champion? 11-0 Alabama, who won 11 SEC football games. And I think the same thing is being said about Oklahoma. 8-2 Oklahoma or whatever it was that they finished, legitimate Big 12 champ, and certainly 10-1 Clemson coming back to beat the Notre Dame, the team that beat them. And by the way, we've talked a lot about Trevor Lawrence. Interesting weekend for Trevor Lawrence to go from a guy who was in a position where now his team's in the playoff, but also where you're thinking he was going to go to the Jets, and there was lots of talk about, hey, is he going to go to New York or not? And suddenly, as people are waking up this morning and starting to look and think about the NFL draft, now very good chance he's going to be in Jacksonville and how that can change the trajectory of both of those franchises. But to me, and this is what we talked about in the first hour of the program as well, every playoff selection is about balancing two conflicting at times ideas, best and most deserving. And it's easy when they come together. Alabama and Clemson were the best and also the most deserving. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes best is an Ohio State, but they're not necessarily the most deserving because they only played 6 games compared to everybody else playing 11. And how much easier is it to win 6 than it is to win 11? A lot easier. How much healthier is it to win 6 instead of winning 11? A lot easier. And that's what I hear a lot of coaches talking about. Hey, when you go through 11 wars like Alabama did in the SEC, there are going to be a lot of casualties. There's a lot of guys that Alabama has lost that are not going to be as healthy as they would have been if they'd only had to play 6 games. And so, in the grand scheme of things, I think it's hard to balance those out. And ultimately, if you're only concerned about the best teams, then why do you even play the season, right? Because if you know already who the most talented teams are, well, we can just look at the recruiting class rankings, and I could have come in this season, and I could have said, hey, the 4 most talented teams in college football this year are Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State,
and Clemson,
right? And so the only difference would be Notre Dame got in over Georgia, right? I mean, but if we were just going to go entirely with talent, then Georgia's more talented than Notre Dame. But that's why you can't do that. You can't just go with best because the best teams have to prove that they're deserving of playing for a championship. And, look, the thing about the college football season is it's hard to win every game. You can ask Ohio State fans about Purdue. You can ask Ohio State fans about Iowa. Ohio State's better than Purdue. They're better than Iowa. They got run in both of those games on the road with crowds present. Would Ohio State have gone 11-0 in the Big Ten this year? I don't know. They might have slipped up against somebody. We know Alabama did it. We know that Clemson was basically perfect with Trevor Lawrence. And so those teams are extremely deserving. If I had been making my choice, I probably would have left Ohio State out and put in the teams that played whole games, whole schedules, close to it, over putting Ohio State in. That's not a shot against Ohio State. Nobody fought harder for the Big Ten to come together than I did. But ultimately, I think the number of games has to factor in a big way. And with Ohio State, it really didn't end up hurting them in any way to only play 6 football games. And that just feels fundamentally hypocritical to me because for the last 5 or 6 years of the playoff, we've said to Notre Dame every year, well, we can't give Notre Dame the credit because they didn't play a conference championship game. They only played 12 and everybody else played 13. And now we're giving Ohio State all that credit, and they only played 6, and every other team in the college football playoff played 11.
Again, it's like, hey, you guys go play 10 games. We assume they're going to win the other 4, so we're just going to ask them to play 6, but they're going to get into the playoff. It's definitely a tough argument to make.